In this module, we're going to be talking about cells, what cells are, the various components of living cells, and how they work. The story of cells starts in the 1660s with an English scientist named Robert Hooke, and he took one of the very first microscopes ever invented, and he looked at a very thin slice of cork. Cork is made from the bark of several trees, and this is what he saw. It was a sort of a honeycomb pattern of seemingly empty little compartments, and he named these compartments cells, and this term is still used today in biology to describe these compartments, which combine to make up what we call a multicellular organism, such as plants. If we look at living cells, because these cork cells, the bark of trees, are composed of cells that are dead at maturity. However, if we looked at living leaf cells, for example, here we could see that they do not appear empty. In fact, they are not empty. However, the only real parts of a living cell that have much color to them, at least in plants, are these small little components within the cell that are green in color, and they're what we refer to as chloroplasts, and we'll get into what chloroplasts do here in a few minutes. So today, if you took a modern microscope, in fact, this photo was taken with a modern light microscope, you get much better resolution than Hooke did back in his day. And so we've been able to, through various techniques of making slides or taking photographs and taking closer looks at living and dead cells, we've been able to determine that there are many parts to a cell, and over the years we've learned more and more about what those individual parts do and how they function. This figure depicts a living plant cell, and this is what we refer to as somewhat of a generic plant cell, in that it has all of the known organelles in it. And throughout this module, we'll be referring to various parts of this drawing. But keep in mind that if you look at a plant cell like we were looking at a second ago, a living plant cell, you are only going to see these little green components and the very edges of the cell. We have colored them in most of our figures and textbooks so that we can easily discern between the various components. But just keep in mind, the green ones are the only ones that really show up as being colored unless we use some sort of dyeing process to color the individual components of the cell. And we call these individual components of a cell organelles. We'll start at the outside and work our way inward. The very first component that we're going to talk about is this outermost portion here, and let me label it here. This is what we refer to as the cell wall. It is the outermost component. Every cell has its own cell wall, and as you can see, this being in cross section, we would have, this is the cell wall of the next door cell. Our actual cell wall on this particular cell would be right in here, and so each cell has its own cell wall. So what does a cell wall do exactly for the plant? Well, the cell wall is made up of a particular type of material that is referred to as cellulose, and this cellulose is very waterproof. It's semi-rigid. It's not particularly strong all by itself, but it's fairly rigid. Now, it is made up of a waterproof material, as we said. However, it is full of all sorts of holes. In fact, if we took an electron microscope view of the cell walls, it would basically look somewhat similar to, if you've ever seen fiberglass, woven fibers. And these fibers are made up of the cellulose. And so although the cellulose material itself is waterproof, the cell wall is not waterproof because it's full of perforations or holes between the fibers. And that's important to remember. The cell walls are stuck together, one cell to the cell next door, by substances such as lignin and pectin, and this is noted in the handout. So let's continue with talking about functions of the cell wall. Cell wall, number one, provides support for the cell. Plants do not have skeletons as we do, and so in order to prop themselves up, they're reliant in large part on the rigidity of the cell wall material. It also is not particularly elastic, and so it therefore defines the volume of the cell. And for the most part, we can also say that it protects the cell contents. Now, it's not particularly strong, and plenty of organisms can break right through a cell wall if they have enough strength, including relatively small insects and even microscopic organisms. So, it's relative in terms of protecting it. So, important things: made of cellulose, not completely waterproof because it's full of holes, and so water readily passes right through a cell wall. Now, the next organelle that we're going to be talking about is found just immediately inside of the cell wall, and this one's going to be a little harder to put a point on here with my pen. And this is what we refer to as the cell membrane. And the cell membrane is right inside of the cell wall. Now, it encompasses the cell, the contents of the cell, and basically is the first part of the cell that we consider to be a living portion of the cell. The photo that we looked at a few minutes ago, these individual cells here, all that's left in these cells that you can see here, that is the cell wall. These cells being dead at maturity, that's all that remains of them, because that cell wall material, remember, cellulose is very water insoluble. And although it's full of holes that water can pass through, it's not easily broken down. The cell membrane is a different story. Cell membrane is not made of cellulose. The cell membrane is considered to be alive. And the cell membrane is made up of various types of materials, but predominantly it's made up of fatty substances called lipids, and we'll get into more details about lipids later on in the course. But basically, the cell membrane, we can consider it to be alive, and one of its jobs is to secrete the cell wall. In other words, the cell membrane is responsible for building the cell wall around a cell, or around a new cell in particular. As the cell expands in volume, its job is to continually produce cell wall around it. Now, the cell membrane, again, is made up of lipids, and we call them, I'll go ahead and write this here, we call these phospholipids in terms of their chemical makeup. They contain phosphorus, and lipids is just a type of fat. But the nature of these phospholipids in the cell membrane is that it gives them a property of being selectively permeable. And this is a very important concept. So what does that mean? Well, when something is selectively permeable, or when we say that a cell membrane is selectively permeable, what it means is that water, or H2O, can pass through it. However, things that are dissolved in the water, known as solutes, okay, and solutes, you can just say things that are dissolved in the water, and that would be a very good definition for that. Solutes in general cannot pass through. And this is very important in terms of how a cell functions. And in fact, many of the organelles within the cell itself have their own membranes, and they have this same selective permeability characteristic as does the cell membrane. And so what does this mean? Well, this means that anything that goes into or out of the cell besides water, the cell has to somehow facilitate the movement. And it does that by the use of various proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane material. And proteins can be used to transport things across the membrane. So we'll say can transport substances across membranes. However, this usually involves the use of energy. So energy is required for this to happen. Okay, so the important things to note are cell membrane is found inside of the cell wall. It actually makes the cell wall material, and it's made out of this phospholipid stuff, which makes it selectively permeable. Water can pass through, solutes cannot. In other words, things dissolved like sugars or various types of salts cannot just pass right through the membrane. The next structure that we want to take a look at is the nucleus, and the nucleus is fairly large. It's not the largest of the organelles, but it's pretty important to the cell's function. Nucleus. The nucleus is typically spherical and it has its own membrane surrounding it. But what's found inside of the nucleus is what makes a nucleus so vital to a cell. So let's talk about that. The nucleus is often referred to as the so-called brains of a cell. And the reason it's referred to as the brains of the cell is that it controls all cellular activity. And so we can write that as one function, controls all cellular activity. It controls it because it contains all of the so-called genes of the cell. And the genes are stored in the form of what we call DNA. Contains the genes. And DNA, basically, we can think of it as being the so-called owner's manual for this cell. Now, what I mean by owner's manual is that everything that this cell, or in fact the entire plant, might need to do, the instructions for how to do it are found in the form of this owner's manual. The owner's manual is written in DNA. If a cell is primarily responsible for photosynthesizing and producing sugars, well, then it's going to be reading the sections of that owner's manual and acting out the sections of that owner's manual that entail how to make sugars. In other words, how to perform photosynthesis. It's sort of like if you had to change the tire on your vehicle, you could look in the owner's manual. You would look up in the index the pages that tell you where the jack and the spare tire are found, rather than being interested in looking at or carrying out the process of changing the oil. Your immediate need in that case would be to change the tire. And so it's the same sort of thing with the DNA, or the so-called genome of any organism. They read the parts of the owner's manual on an as-needed basis, and they use it to carry out all of their functions. Also found in the nucleus is a similar type of stuff called RNA, and RNA is used to make copies of genes, okay, that are expendable. If you have this owner's manual, it's pretty important to a cell. It tells it how it can do everything that it ever needs to do. And so I like to use the example of the reference section in a library. The reference section of the library usually has things like maps and encyclopedias, and tends to have the kind of materials that are not easily replaced or that are particularly expensive to replace. And so they don't let people check them out and take them home typically. If you want to access that information, however, you can look at it, and nowadays you can make a photocopy of it or even scan it possibly. And so, we could think of the RNA as being photocopies of the owner's manual, and they're expendable copies is the point. So I'll just put that also as a note. Expendable copies of the DNA code. Also found within a nucleus is a very dark region called the nucleolus. And this nucleolus is thought to mainly direct the manufacture of the next organelle that we're going to talk about, called ribosomes. So we'll say makes ribosomes. And looking back at our figure here, this dark region right in here would be the nucleolus. And so we'll go ahead and label that. I think we'll have enough room. Nucleolus. All right. The next organelle that we're concerned with, and this again is going to be tough, I'm going to point to one of these, is referred to as a ribosome. And I'll do another one here and just draw a little dot. So that just, you can see that we're pointing at these little dots here. A ribosome job is to get directions from a nucleus and basically carry out its instructions. And these ribosomes are made up of proteins, and basically we'll say they get instructions from RNA, okay, and we'll say they use instructions to make proteins. And so that's their job. Now, to expand on this a little bit, we need to consider the process. And basically what happens is the nucleus determines that something needs to happen, and so it accesses the correct gene that carries the instruction, or the correct pages, let's say, of the owner's manual, and from that point it makes an RNA copy, which is expendable, which leaves the nucleus and goes out to the ribosome, who reads the directions and uses it to make a protein. And that's the basic job of a ribosome. And if we look back up here again at our figure, you'll notice that there are quite a few ribosomes in the general vicinity of the nucleus, which makes sense because that's where the instructions for what the ribosome is going to do next come from. And so it makes good sense to have most of the ribosomes close to the nucleus.